slide. He has a different beard now. He was he spent 20 years in prison for being a Christian. Okay, so he was a pastor at Leningrad. That was the city. It was back then called Leningrad. I think it's called Petersburg. Okay. Same with this man. He also was like a chairman of the Union Baptists, and he was imprisoned, and then he died in prison. The prison life was very, very harsh. It's not like it's here. Here you have air conditioning and heating, and you got your TV and everything else. It wasn't that way. So even though I say that they were in prison for so many years, you can multiply that several times for the condition, considering the conditions that they were there. So even going to Siberia for 5 years could actually be, you could consider it like a life sentence. Barely anyone returned at the time. Okay. This man was imprisoned and shot. Your fate, and they decided you have to be shot, and you were shot. So she was shot as well, and her 4 kids were orphans. And next slide. This man was also shot, and this is the document that explains how he was searched and what they took away and when I think he was shot. Okay, go ahead. And here, this piece of paper, this document says how this man was arrested at the time and the date, and he, on there, it says, short lettering, it was like an abbreviation, 3 letters, means that he was shot by shooting, and this is the day when that was done, and here down here it says that they told the family that he died from kidney inflammation, and that's why he died. And only later on, many years later, his family would actually find out when they pulled up the documents from the files, they found out that he was actually shot, and the family was lied to, and that's what they were doing all the time. They would lie to the family. They would say, they died because he got sick, but he was actually shot. Okay, go ahead. This man also was. He was building, I think, a railroad, I think, and he also died. And back then, in prisons, they did not have a name. They were just a number. That was 1953. Okay, go ahead. And this is the tower from which the guards were keeping watch over their prisoners so they wouldn't run away. And this is the tundra, I guess. It's just a lot of mosquitoes, very wild, and a lot of animals. Okay. And this is the railroad that they were building. This project is called number 503, and they called it the Dead Way. And many people died building this railroad in the Stalin's time. And it was sometimes so cold out there that, actually it's almost, probably frozen like almost year-round there. And that they were sometimes, instead of putting railroad ties from the wood, as you can see, the trees are not very thick, so they were sometimes using human bodies who were dead, and they would just use them as railroad ties. Actually, this railroad is so useless now. I mean, so many people died building this railroad, and now it's just useless because the rails are not very standard. They're kind of thin. I actually know a man. I've been to Siberia. I know a man that actually bought like a military kind of tank that he just cuts them apart and hauls them and makes money off of them by just turning them in for metal. So now they're just kind of useless. But many people died, and many Christians died building these railroads. Okay. And this was a detention center into which they were put. So, the windows are open, and it was frozen outside, and they were just sitting there in cold, and their clothes was not very warm. Okay. And in every place where the prisoners were, there was this portrait of Stalin, and they called him the Sun. Actually, because their son, their everything, and there were the rules of prison. Okay. And here are some of the prisoners from the Stalin's time. for the churches. Okay, go on. Okay, so this is the mom and that's the son who were Christian. I think they were released early or something, but they were they had to sit in prison. It wasn't ordered that they would sit in prison for 25 years. Okay. And this is they were doing logging and those are the circumstances they were in. This is what I think 6. So they were cutting logs. Okay, you can go on. You know, and when this persecution started happening, some of the Christians got afraid and actually decided to work with the government like they were told or asked. So this man right there that says a speech right there, that's an Orthodox priest, and they were persecuting Christians. And here on the right by him is sitting that pastor, which is then saying a little speech. So some of them decided to work with the government and with Stalin to destroy the church because they were afraid to be put in prison. And so that's how the Christianity actually split up in this past Soviet Union. Some of them were afraid of being sent to prison, and they started to work with the government. And here this man is actually saying a speech about the Day of Victory on May 9th. That was the Day of Victory over Nazis. So here he is saying a speech. Okay. And when that happened, the government actually were able to get some of the Christians, some of the Christian leaders to work for them. They would take them, and the government would, they wanted to control the church because their main goal was actually to eradicate the church and get rid of the church. And so they got some of the pastors, some of the Christian pastors that were willing to work with them, and they put them in churches. And here are the little notes that were sent to churches. Like one of them, actually both of them are saying that we put your pastor away, but we got you this new pastor that we came up with, that we chose. So here's your new pastor, and he will be your pastor from now on. But their pastors were very. They were like wolves in the sheepfold. Okay. And the government wanted to control everything. And here is this law, actually, where the instruction letter from the government that actually says that do not allow them to eat together, to do a harvest celebration. Don't allow any of that. And if any Christians, any churches wanted to celebrate a harvest celebration, they have to get a permission from the government for that, and usually they were refused, so they were denied that because of their decision. Okay, go ahead. Next slide. And here they later on they came up with more and more rules that were limiting the Christians to do things. So here they were saying, you can go to church for so many days in the week. You have to have a certain number of preachers and no more than that. The age of the ones that are baptized, things like that. So they were starting to limit the church. They were basically trying to suffocate the church slowly. Okay, go ahead and show the next. So the pastor that they would set up in the church, the pastor that would work for the government, would report everything about his church to the government, and he would give them a list. He would give them a list of church members, and not only that, so he would give to the government their name, their last name, their middle name, his date of birth, the year when he became a Christian, when he was chosen, his home address, and then the place where he worked, and what he was doing, and his job. So it actually, I think you know why they wanted to know the place of the work where he worked, right? Okay. Later they would sometimes take their jobs away. And here, this pastor would come up with a list of people that he wanted to baptize, and again would send it away to the government saying, these are the people that I want to baptize. This was actually sent to the higher pastor the higher pastor in the government was also working for the government. Okay. And then the baptism sometimes would happen, and it would be, it would happen in the Baptist too. We baptize our people outside in the river, but the government, they were not happy with people seeing how Christians are being baptized out in the public. So they said, no, you can't do that. You gotta baptize them in the baptistry. And so they would baptize them there. And when they would do that, and I think go to the next slide. Actually, I'll tell you later. Actually, a little more. They wouldn't even allow the family members to go to the baptism, and they would do it on the weekdays, so when no one is at church. So it was kind of a hidden thing. That's what they were instructed to do by the government. They said that you cannot do a show like that outside. And here you got a list of more limits for the church. So, and here they were saying that kids cannot attend church now. So what they wanted to do is they wanted old people to die off, and they thought the church or the Christianity would be over. So, and then that was one of the instructions that the children from preschool and school age are not supposed to be allowed in churches.
What year was that?
I believe that was in 61. Yeah, 61. 1961.
How old did they have to be before they got baptized?
I think it was decided by the government. I think if they were thinking that they were a little young, they would allow. Okay. Yeah. And here, this is actually a list of people that are to be baptized. This was sent to the government, and actually, this one man, I guess one person was crossed off because he was too young. So cannot let him baptized, even though he was a real Christian. Let's say. Okay. So yes, and I told you about this already. Now, when this started happening, when some of the Christians realized how the government is actually trying to suffocate the church, and they were trying to eradicate or destroy the church, some of the Christians put themselves on a altar, sacrificed themselves, and wrote a letter. They were called the initiative group. Several people were the initiative group. There was actually two main men in that group, and then they got more later on, that sent a letter to the pastors that were working with the government saying, this isn't right. We think this isn't the way to go. Because the Christians or the pastors that were working with the government, they were saying, well, that's how we'll stay alive, and that's how we'll save Christianity. We'll keep Christianity by working with the government. They won't destroy us, and maybe sometime there will be freedom. But here, this initiative group sent a letter to them saying, no, this should not be the way. Okay, let me go to the next slide. And here is this initiative group, and that's the home where they were gathering at first. And they had to gather, somewhere far away from the eyes of the KGB. I think the KGB is basically like an FBI. I'm not sure why there's a name KGB. Okay. And then this initiative group sent a letter to all churches explaining the situation. Okay, go on to the next slide. And then the pastors, when they received the letter, the pastors that were working with the government, when they received a letter from this initiative group, they said, oh, let's excommunicate everyone that supports this initiative group. And so they sent a letter to their churches saying, excommunicate everyone who supports this initiative group, because we got to work with the government, they said. So excommunicate everyone who does not work with the government. Okay, go on to the next slide. So these were the main two men. So actually, Dad was sure about that one. That as well. That were they were hiding from the FBI, I guess. And actually, this man, I think, was hidden for 25 years, and they couldn't find him. For 25 years, they couldn't find him. And actually, they told some of the Christians that you guys are lying about him being alive, because if he would be alive, we would find him by now, or he is probably dead. But actually, he was alive, and he was hiding. It was a very great conspiracy for him to hide. And I've heard that he sometimes wanted to visit a dentist because his teeth were sometimes hurting, and he couldn't. He couldn't leave the place where he was, or else he'll be found. So he had to live in isolation, sort of say, and yeah, great conspiracy. And he was the one that was sending out instructions to the other church leaders on what to do and how to survive spiritually. Okay, go ahead. And this was the man that I showed you with one beard, and the other he sent to a letter in 36 to the people of God, or to Christians, saying that we should, sanctify ourselves, and so that God would be with us. He knew that, this is a very, very dangerous battle with the government, and that if God's not with us, then the government will overtake. They'll overcome. They'll destroy us if God won't be on our side. And so he said, you have to sanctify yourselves, so that God will be with you, so that God will protect you and lead you. And then he died in prison. Okay, go ahead. And they made up this book. This initiative group made up this book and distributed it to all the churches. And this was actually explaining what is sinful, what's not, so that people would actually wake up and repent if needed, and get rid of their sins, so that God would be on their side. But it was a very, the Communist Party was they were very determined, and they were very intelligent and skilled finding enemies and getting rid of enemies and dealing with them. And so it was not an easy, it was not like it wasn't something that people could go against and win if God would be on their side. So that's why they were doing all these things. That's why Christians were doing all these things. And this was in 1974. And here the government actually got worried. They were worried because they sent a letter to themselves, among themselves in the government, saying that we're worried about this little book that they sent out. And some of the people from the registered churches, so there were the unregistered, the old people, the old folk churches which had no children, and they also got interested in that little book, and the government was worried that they were interested, and they were saying we have to find the printing press that's printing all these things, because they felt that if they'll be sanctified, if they'll live a holy life, they won't be able to go against them. I think that's why they were worried. Okay. And so they were searching people's homes, and this is just a picture of one of the searches where they were searching everything they could, and they took away any Christian literature, tapes, and the radios, even postcards, photos, anything that had any Bible verses on it, and letters, and the money. So they would take it all away, and they would leave without making any, they would make a mess indeed. Okay. And they were also making fun of them in this claiming that we're actually saying bad things or wrong things or false things about them in newspapers. Okay, and there were several articles in the newspaper to the public regarding Christians. Go ahead. This actually says the spider's web. So being a Christian is a spider. To get into a spider's web. That's what they were saying. This little person was actually born in prison. So he was one of the Christian ladies was in prison being pregnant, and so he was born in prison. And they were also made fun of on TV. They would film their court cases and put it out on TV and make fun of them. this man, I think this was at a gathering in the woods, like a church gathering in the woods, and they were trying to scatter Christians to leave the place where they were gathered in the woods, and they shot one man in the back, like 17 years old. Okay. And since it was a conspiracy thing, like pastors have to know where to go, what's the address of that church, or what's the address of a printing press. So they would jot all the addresses on a piece of cloth, and that would be in their clothes. They would sew it in their clothes, like whatever, the underpant, kind of the thigh, where whatever, where they could sew all the addresses, because they were often at times search for any papers or anything like that. Okay. This is the place where the house of prayer was, where the church was broken twice, like down to the ground. They would just bring in a bulldozer and bulldoze it down. Okay. And in schools, they had to wear these red scarves on their necks, signifying that they were atheists and that they supported the Communist Party. So they wanted to make children communists from the very, very early age. And right in the middle, you see that one at the top is all wore uniforms back then, and the top in the middle is a lady that does not wear one, so she's a Christian. But there was a lot of pressure put on them to wear one of those. In the 1970s, they confiscated a home from a family. They have how many children do they have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 kids. Yeah, 8 kids. So they took their home away because the church was gathering in their home. When they found out, when the KGB found out that the house of prayer was actually this home, they took it away. Okay, go ahead. And they would take away their homes, and oftentimes would just make like a supply room or a supply house out of their home. Go ahead. And boys were pressured to wear a star like this with a Lenin, with a little boy Lenin right in the middle of that star. And these kids were called the Octoberists, if you know what I mean. There was a revolution against the king in October, and so they took that date and actually called the kids Octoberists. And the one on the left doesn't have that little star. Same thing, as with the scarf. A lot of pressure was put on kids to wear that. And sometimes, instead of building a house of prayer, they would make up a tent. But in this place, the KGB broke the tent like 8 times in one place. Okay, go ahead. And you know how I said that when a pastor would tell the government who is in his church, all the church members, he would tell their name, their birth date, and everything, and the place where they worked. The place where they worked was because they needed that, because for every Christian on their job, they would put a person right behind him, that says this person is a Christian, and this guy will be, we'll try to convert him to atheism later. So they would work on their job, and at the same time they were pressuring them or influencing them to become an atheist. So for every person, for every Christian, they were trying to brainwash them on their job. Okay. On here, the government had a list of places where the church was gathering, so they could scatter them, chase them away. And they would also note the people that owned the home. Okay. So, and here you can probably just show several faces of people who were imprisoned. He was judged twice and imprisoned. This guy, just several of them. He was judged 3 times and imprisoned 3 times. Go ahead and keep going. Same thing. Keep going. He actually died. Oh, he was died because he was tortured in the time of interrogation. So that's when he died. Also imprisoned for Christ. And there's just too much to see, faces to see that were imprisoned. I think in the past Soviet Union, they've added all the times when people were imprisoned for being Christians, and I think it added to like 5,000 years. If they would add all the time of imprisonment for Christians, 5,000 years. Okay. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. So some of them later or right after prison would die, have their family by their coffin. Okay. Keep going. Keep going. This man, his name is called Khmara, which means cloud. When he was interrogated, he was brutally tortured and died. And the Christians protested so much that the government actually admitted that they have tortured this man real bad. And they said that, yes, we'll judge the people that have tortured them to death. And it was kind of a turning point, you know, it was kind of a boiling point in Christian persecution in the past Soviet Union where they got real severe on Christians. And after this point, it wasn't so bad. But someone had to pay the price. Okay. So, and these are some of the Christians that were tortured, and it shows the pictures of their faces and how they were beaten, and poked and prodded and tortured real bad. Keep going. Same thing with this man. Keep going. I don't know how he died, but he was judged 4 times. Okay, keep going. This was a young man that actually was tortured also. I think he was from 1952 to 1972. So he was 20 years old when he was tortured brutally in prison. Not in prison, but in the army. People in the Soviet Union had to go to the army whether they wanted to or no. It was not a choice. So, and Christians would go there and would not take an oath of a soldier because they, would not take arms. And I think that's one of the reasons why he was tortured to death. Same thing with this guy. You can see him in the army clothes. Same thing with this guy and the guy down there. Same with him. This was a lady that died. Who knows what it's kind of an odd death that she died. So they're thinking that they also killed her too. Same thing with him. They don't know why he really died. It was kind of an unusual death. And when this started happening, when there was a lot of prisoners in the prison, their wives who stayed at home united into this union of, it was a union of the prisoners, of the imprisoned. And so they would be the ones that would make up notifications, or they would make up letters and they would send it around all the unregistered churches saying this man and this man was imprisoned, pray for him, support him, financially, spiritually, and they would also send petitions, or they would send out petitions to the churches, and then churches would sign them and send them to the government, so the government wouldn't imprison them anymore, although they still imprison them. So here is a list of the prisoners that they had, their addresses and other families, and they were supporting them. For some reason, the persecution is going on in China right now, but they don't have this kind of system right now. I'm not sure why. This was the first Christian camp in 1979, and the guys down there had to pay for this. But it was the first Christian camp. So they were trying to save the kids. They were trying to teach kids real good things from the Bible, and but the government was not willing for them, they were not happy with this. They wanted to teach kids themselves and make them atheists. And that's just, again, like a notification to the church that this man was involved. And then this was a list of all the prisoners. Same thing, this is like an urgent notification that, someone got sick in prison or whatever. And here's the petition that the church signed and sent to the government. This spent 8 years in prison and was released early because he got sick with tuberculosis and died at home shortly after coming from prison. And this was the Gospel of Luke that people wrote over, with their own hand. So there was not a lot of Bibles as you guys have it. I mean, we can buy them on garage sales and at a dollar store or whatever. And that was a rare commodity back then, so they had to copy the Bible by their own hand. This was the Gospel of Luke. He spent 24 years in prison. She was released early. She was a member of the Union of the imprisoned, and so she was put in prison and then released early because she got real sick and died 3 months later. Actually from the city where I was. So the church sent her a card, like a postcard, congratulating her with release, but then she died 3 months early. 3 months later. This lady had 5 kids, and she was imprisoned, and the kids were taken away and put to the orphanage. This man, I think he spent the most in prison, 28 years. And again, like I said, 28 years in the United States seems like, he still has some life to live. Right after that. But actually, he died in prison. So the imprisonment was very, very harsh. Now, you're wondering, how did they print, by what printing press did they print the Bibles or the booklets that they had? You couldn't just go in a store and buy a copy machine and copy a lot of leaflets, you couldn't do that. So what they were doing at first, this was a very, very scrupulous work. What they had to do is they had to find any articles from any newspaper or books, like even atheist books, right? And go through the book and cut out the words and the letters that they actually wanted. So they would cut them out. Okay, and so from journals, magazines and stuff, they would cut them out and paste them on a different sheet. Okay, let's just keep going. And these were the tools that they were using. So they were kind of, with a little Sharpie, they were trying to, align the little letter and the little sentence. And then they would make up a list of the text they wanted. So they had sets of the letters they wanted, and this is what actually came out to be. This was the final product. Okay? And this was the design where they were putting the sentence on that line, and they were they were going down lower and lower, trying to paste all those letters. Copy and paste, was not simple at that time as it is now. And this is by that same method. This is the Gospel of John, made with that application method, from cutting out little letters. And this was the product that they came up with. Actually, it looks very real, like as if they were printed. And this was the Bible written by hand. This was for the kids. They also had a method of making the letters very inky. They would put a bunch of ink on every letter, and then they would have a layer of gel. And they would put that sheet on a layer of gel, like a petri dish gel, if you know, like gelatin. They would put it on there, and that ink would kind of go down into that gel. They would take the paper off and put a blank sheet on there, and that ink would kind of stick back on, would transfer to the blank sheet, and that's how they were printing some of the stuff. But that had to be written out by hand. And this was also done by the method of that little application and cutting and pasting. This is the Gospel of John. Same thing. And this was the printing press that they came up with. You know what it was made of? It was made out of like washing machines and stuff like that. It was actually very, some people were, I think God gave them wisdom to come up with this thing that, it was 2 or 3 people. They were engineers, they were Christians, and they came up with this. And they were able to print a lot of Bibles with this printing press right here. So you see like a stack of papers that it's making. This is a similar thing. Okay, so they would print all the pages and then fold each page by hand. And oftentimes they would fold them, and their fingers or their fingertips would often kind of wear off, or you would erase, not erase, but the skin would come off, and they would sometimes bleed. And they had to work in quiet. This was the cutting thing they had to trim all the pages. This is the place where they were actually printing the Bible. So this was the home, the upper, the attic, right? Right under the roof. I'm not sure if you can magnify that or. This is where they were printing. Very messy but those were poor homes. And that's where they were printing. And the top picture is where they were sleeping. And their windows were covered all the time. They would try to make them soundproof. And what I heard that in every printing press, every moment, every minute, for a lot of years, someone from the printing or from the printers was printing. So there were several people in that team would look into the, on the doors they have what the little, the keyhole, the peephole. Okay, right. So everyone, all the time, someone day and night would watch by that little peephole to watch if someone was coming. And sometimes this is how they were trying to transport paper. They were to print more Bibles, and sometimes they would get caught, put in prison. They would take the car away. And this is the things that they were printing. Same method application, but then later on, once they got the printing press, and to make up the printing press, to make every page of the Bible, they actually had to use the application method to make metal sheets of the press, to make up the sheets of the Bible. So, and the government was actually outraged. They could not. These were the printers. They couldn't believe that something like this was actually going on in the past Soviet Union. They were thinking that they had to get a prize of some sort for doing such a feat, because when they looked at their printing stuff, what they printed. So those were the people that were printing. And some of them died from the fumes of the ink, because it was not, very well ventilated, and it was very dark there, not a lot of sunlight. They were working like day and night sometimes. They couldn't get outside too much because, they were watched all the time. So some of them breathed in a little too much of that stuff and died. So there was a lot of ladies that worked there too. And they would sometimes go, the way they would start working is they would leave their family, and even their own family wouldn't know where they went. So they would forsake their family and work in the printing press until they were imprisoned, or until they, got sick. So this was all volunteer work. No one paid them for it. So this is the price of the Bible. Actually, they died, and I think they made up a collision for them where they died. Printers. Actually, go back. This was one of the men that made up that printing press. Keep going. Here they are leading one of the Christians to court. 1983. This is how prisoners would socialize with their family across the window. These are actually the flowers that, they were throwing flowers on Christian prisoners, like their families, as I guess as a little as a sign of respect, and they would sometimes save them and drag them out. This is how prisoners were searched. Oftentimes, it was outside. It was very cold, and everyone back there had to wait in line. And, they would get frostbitten, and sometimes they would socialize like this with their family. Boys looking at their dad. This is in the camp, inside the area. And inside the area, there would not be any bars or walls. I mean, you could. It was just impossible to walk back to home. It was too far, too cold, too dangerous. A lot of swamps and tundra that no one even dared to walk back. So this was the kind of prison. It was kind of a lighter way of being in prison. So sometimes they would be put in prison for 3 years, and then 5 years of this, to be inside the area, to live there. And then they would sometimes, the family would sometimes bring in food to them because they fed them really poorly. So this wife brought some bacon to prison. Now, a pile of letters right here was given to a prisoner when he was released. So the family and the church was sending letters to him, thinking that he was reading them. But the thing is, the government was so strict sometimes, is they wouldn't allow the prisoner to read all the letters. They did not want Christians to be in virgin prison. He wanted them to be depressed, and so that they would withhold all the letters. And sometimes they would give them back to them right after they were released. And so this man got like 2 bags full of letters when he was released. This was the dress that the lady that was in prison sewed together from a bottom sheet or a top sheet for herself by hand. Same thing. This was actually made up of worn out clothes, from pieces of worn out clothes. This was the coat. So it wasn't even the shirt, it was the coat of a prisoner. Very thin. If it was very cold, and oftentimes it had fleas on it or ticks or whatever, it was full of it. Sometimes what prisoners would do is they would take off their clothes, take a hammer when they had a break, and hammer the whole clothes so they would kill all the ticks there. The handcuffs and the pants. Now these are the little slippers. These are slippers that a Christian lady, she was imprisoned in. When she came to prison, they would sometimes donate their own clothes to the prisoners that were there as a sign of respect, as a sign of love. And for themselves, they would make up some slippers out of just thin material, and for the sole of the slipper, it was just newspaper. But they had to walk on concrete floors, which were very cold. So, and this was the towel that she made up, and they were trying to stay. I don't know, courageous. And they were courageous, but they were trying to stay happy in prison. And this one actually says, "Good morning," on it. So this was in prison. This was a hat of a prisoner. This is a scrapbook that a prisoner made for himself in prison. So some of the prisoners, if they did not make the government angry too much, I guess, they would sometimes, or by petitions, they were allowed letters. They would be allowed to read letters from their own family, and so they would sometimes get pictures and little notes. They would make up a scrapbook like this. Any Bible verse that, while they were in prison, they could not have a Bible. If at some time, someone reminded them of a verse or something, or someone sent them a verse in a letter, they would jot it down right away in their own book, so they wouldn't lose it, and so that they could read it over and over again. So they were so thirsty for the Bible. This was a concordance that a man was trying to come up with in prison. You know what I mean by concordance? A book that you could find a place in the Bible real quick. Someone actually was able to recover the book of Hebrews, I think, maybe from his own memory. On a piece of sheet. So there we go. We came to an end. So we got a little bit of time. Now, when I look through all this, when I recall all this, I think, with what kind of a price did those Christians pay for their belief? And they paid a huge price like that because they had a true faith. And they were able, they were willing to give up everything they had, even their own life, for God, for their faith. And it's not the way it is when everything's good, and if a country is very civilized and they've got all the things they need, people in that country actually often don't think they don't need God, and they think it's a useless thing. But when people end up in situations like this, in hard situations when they don't have a lot of things in their life, that's when they realize that they need support and they need help. They turn to God because there's no one else to turn to. So they turn to God, and actually God sometimes does miracles for them and supports them in their faith. So I'm hoping that I will later on in my life, living in this country, living in this rich country, although we had a shutdown, right? Will value the Bible. Will value the Bible more and more. Because here, the guys paid their life for the Bible. If my Bible is just laying on a shelf and it's full of dust is sitting on the Bible, I should probably think about myself and what am I doing? Do I really value the Bible? And these guys value the Bible. And so may God help me to value His Word and value the faith, and may He help you as well. May He help you, to realize that it's actually a very valuable, precious thing. And may God bless you in that.
Just one more hill to climb, just one more valley looming, another mountain pass, above a steep abyss, still just a few more tears, and bitterness of weeping, for God has promised rest, eternal joy and bliss.
Дорогие друзья,
Dear friends,
мы сегодня вам рассказали о том пути, который проходила наша церковь, наше братство.
you were explained or told how, by what way our church and our brotherhood walked by.
Мой брат говорил о том, что невозможно было даже предположить, что когда-то эта система может быть разрушена.
And my brother told how it was almost impossible to even imagine that such a system, such a communist system, could be broken down.
Мое поколение захватило эти гонения, я тоже в них участвовал.
And people of my age actually have been in that persecution, and I actually participated in that.
Нам крутили руки, нас бросали в тюрьмы.
Hands were tied behind our backs and we were thrown in prison.
И нам действительно казалось, что невозможно сломить эту страшную машину.
And we actually thought that it's impossible to break this whole huge machine down.
Но церковь осталась верной на пути идти за Господом.
But church was faithful in following God.
И Господь видел кровью политый вот этот след церкви.
And God saw the bloody footprints of Christians.
И Он сам развалил эту сатанинскую
And he
машину.
himself destroyed or broke down the communist system of the Soviet Union.
То, что вам здесь было показано, это только маленькая частица того пути, которым, тем страданий, которые прошла
And
церковь.
you've only seen a small portion of what the church had to go through in that Soviet Union.
Если все вам рассказать, это страшно просто было.
And it's a horrible thing to tell the whole thing about what happened.
Но Бог провел путем испытаний и страданий церковь, и сейчас в России свобода.
And God led His church through the path of suffering, and now there's freedom in Russia.
Эти стены, которыми окружал враг церковь, они рухнули.
And the iron curtain, or the walls that the devil surrounded the church with, they broke down.
Сегодня мы можем благодарить Бога, что там мы можем проповедовать свободно об Иисусе
And we
Христе.
thank God that we can preach freely today out there.
Сегодня много людей освобождаются от пороков и грехов.
And many people today are, being freed from all the bad habits and sins.
Мы на собственном опыте знаем, как велик Бог.
And we know how great God is on our own experience.
Проводя путем страданий, Он выводит на широкую долину потом.
He leads out to a wide path of freedom.
Ему стоит доверить свою жизнь.
So it's very good to commit your life. It's worth it to commit your life to Him.
Он никогда не оставлял своих.
And He never forsook His own.
Поэтому наше желание было, чтобы вы, посмотрев вот этот, послушав в своем положили быть верными Господу.
And what our desire as well.
И вы будете радоваться еще в жизни. Доверьте свою жизнь Господу.
And you will rejoice in your life if you will trust your life to the Lord.
А сейчас я вас попрошу встать, и мы помолимся за прощение.
We'll stand up and pray, and we'll pray in the end.